Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history, California. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. In the autumn of 1849, when gold fever had transformed the quiet valleys of Northern California into a labyrinth of makeshift camps and desperate ambitions, there stood a peculiar establishment along the muddy thoroughfare of what would later become Nevada County. The Gilded Rose Saloon, operated by two sisters whose names would eventually be whispered in the same breath as the region's darkest secrets, occupied a strategic position where three mining trails converged near the American River's northern tributaries. Cordelia and Isadora Ashworth had arrived from somewhere back east during the summer of that year, though their exact origins remained deliberately vague in the scattered records that survived the era. What made their establishment noteworthy was not the quality of their whiskey or the entertainment they provided, but rather the unusual number of prospectors who entered their doors flush with gold dust and were never seen departing with their fortunes intact. The initial reports came from a traveling merchant named Josiah Whitmore, who maintained meticulous records of his transactions throughout the mining camps that dotted the Sierra Nevada foothills. Whitmore's commercial routes took him through dozens of settlements each month, and his keen eye for detail had made him one of the most trusted suppliers of goods and information in the region. According to his journal, discovered decades later in a trunk at a San Francisco boarding house during an estate sale in 1923, Whitmore had conducted business with no fewer than 23 different miners who specifically mentioned their intentions to celebrate successful claims at the Gilded Rose between October and December of 1849. Of these 23 men, only 5 were ever documented as making subsequent purchases or appearing in any other merchant's records throughout the following spring mining season. Whitmore's notes, written in the careful script of a man accustomed to tracking valuable commodities across treacherous terrain, included observations that seemed mundane at the time, but would later take on a more sinister significance when examined by territorial investigators. He noted that the Ashworth sisters always seemed to know exactly how much gold a man carried, often before he had announced his good fortune to anyone else in the camp. More unsettling was their apparent knowledge of which miners had struck particularly rich veins and which were struggling with marginal claims, information that should have been closely guarded secrets in an environment where claim jumping was a constant threat. The merchant also observed that both sisters displayed an unusual familiarity with mining terminology and geological concepts that seemed far beyond what would be expected from saloon operators who had allegedly arrived in California with no previous experience in gold country. Before the strange disappearances began to form a recognizable pattern, life in the mining district followed the brutal rhythm that characterized most gold rush settlements scattered throughout the Sierra Nevada. Men would disappear into the hills for weeks at a time, following rumors of rich strikes along remote creeks or simply abandoning played-out claims for more promising prospects in distant valleys. The transient nature of the population meant that absence rarely raised immediate concern among the loosely organized communities that had sprung up around successful mining areas. Prospectors were known to vanish suddenly when their luck ran out, when debts became overwhelming, or when news arrived from family members back east requiring immediate attention. The harsh realities of frontier life meant that death from accidents, disease, exposure, or violence was common enough that temporary disappearances were generally attributed to natural causes rather than criminal activity. Cordelia, the elder sister by approximately 4 years, according to the fragmentary records that survived, managed the saloon's daily operations with an efficiency that impressed even the most successful businessmen who passed through the area during their periodic inspection tours of mining investments. She possessed an unusual talent for remembering names, faces, and personal details about her customers, creating an atmosphere of familiarity that many miners found comforting after months of solitary labor in the mountains. Her ability to recall specific conversations, family circumstances, and business arrangements made her a valuable source of information for prospectors seeking advice about which areas might prove most profitable for future exploration. Isadora, younger and more reserved in her interactions with customers, maintained the establishment's books and handled the more delicate aspects of their business arrangements with visiting suppliers and territorial officials. She spoke little during public hours, but observed everything with pale blue eyes that seemed to catalog and file away every detail of her customers' behavior, financial circumstances, and personal vulnerabilities. The building itself reflected the hastily constructed nature of most Gold Rush architecture, but with certain peculiarities that set it apart from neighboring establishments throughout the mining district. The main saloon occupied the ground floor, featuring rough-hewn timber walls, a bar constructed from local pine, and a collection of mismatched tables and chairs that had been acquired from various sources as the establishment grew in popularity. A narrow staircase, built with more attention to structural integrity than aesthetic appeal, led to a series of private rooms above where customers could secure lodging or conduct confidential business meetings away from the noise and activity of the main floor. What distinguished the Gilded Rose from other saloons in the area was the basement, which the sisters claimed served as storage for their liquor inventory and other supplies necessary for their operation. Unlike most buildings in the area, which were erected directly on the ground or on simple wooden foundations that could be quickly assembled and easily abandoned, the Gilded Rose featured a stone foundation with an unusually deep cellar that extended well below the frost line. Local records from the Nevada County Courthouse, archived in 1954 during a systematic preservation effort by the California Historical Society, indicate that the sisters had specifically requested permission from territorial authorities to excavate beyond the standard depth typically allowed for commercial establishments. Their written application, preserved in the courthouse files, cited concerns about temperature control for their valuable whiskey supplies and mentioned their intention to store other perishable goods that required protection from the extreme temperature variations common in the Sierra Nevada climate. The request was granted without question by officials who considered such attention to business detail admirable in an era when most establishments operated with little regard for long-term planning or structural permanence. The first incident that would later be recognized as significant in the developing pattern of disappearances occurred in November 1849, when a miner named Bartholomew Crane failed to appear for a scheduled meeting with his business partner regarding the development of a promising claim they had been working together in the hills above the settlement. Crane had discovered what appeared to be a particularly rich vein of quartz laced with gold in a remote canyon approximately 6 miles northeast of the Gilded Rose, and had arranged to meet with his partner to discuss the formation of a more formal partnership agreement that would allow them to properly extract and process the ore they had located. His partner, Ezekiel Morrison, waited at their agreed meeting place for several hours before eventually learning from other miners that Crane had been seen entering the Gilded Rose the previous evening, apparently in celebratory spirits and displaying a leather pouch that clinked with the distinctive sound of high-quality gold nuggets. When Morrison questioned the Ashworth sisters about Crane's visit, Cordelia expressed appropriate concern for his welfare and provided what seemed to be a reasonable account of the evening's events. She explained that Crane had indeed visited their establishment, arriving shortly after sunset and spending several hours celebrating what he had described as his most successful day of mining since arriving in California. According to her account, Crane had consumed a considerable amount of whiskey and had become increasingly talkative about his discovery, providing detailed descriptions of the ore quality and his plans for expanding his operation. She mentioned that he had left the saloon around midnight, claiming he needed to return to his claim to secure some valuable equipment he had left unprotected during his absence. Cordelia offered this information with the appropriate level of concern, even volunteering to organize a search party if Crane failed to appear within a reasonable period. The explanation seemed entirely plausible given the harsh realities of mining life and the numerous dangers that awaited unwary prospectors traveling alone through the rugged terrain surrounding the settlement. Claim jumpers operated throughout the region, targeting successful miners who were known to be working particularly promising sites. Wild animals, including bears and mountain lions, posed constant threats to solitary travelers, especially those who might be impaired by alcohol or carrying items that could attract predators. Accidents involving unstable excavations, falling rocks, or treacherous stream crossings claimed many lives during the gold rush period. Simple exposure to the elements could prove fatal for miners who became lost or injured while traveling between their claims and the settlement, particularly during the autumn months when weather conditions could change rapidly and dramatically. Crane's disappearance was duly recorded in the informal notes kept by the settlement's self-appointed constable, a former Union Army sergeant named Patrick O'Malley, who had assumed responsibility for maintaining basic order in the community. O'Malley's records, maintained in a series of composition books that were donated to the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley in 1967, reflect the pragmatic approach to law enforcement that characterized most mining communities during this period. His entry regarding Crane's disappearance noted the basic facts surrounding the case, but made no recommendation for formal investigation, reflecting the general understanding that such incidents were unfortunate but inevitable consequences of frontier life. The abandoned claim was eventually taken over by other prospectors, as was customary when a miner failed to work his property for an extended period, and Crane's personal effects at his campsite were distributed among those who had known him, following the informal inheritance practices common in mining communities. What made Crane's case noteworthy in retrospect was a detail discovered much later, when his original claim was finally exhausted and abandoned in the spring of 1851. New prospectors working the area found evidence of a campsite that appeared to have been hastily abandoned, with personal effects scattered throughout the area, as if the occupant had left suddenly under duress or in extreme haste. Among these items was a journal containing entries that contradicted the timeline provided by the Ashworth sisters regarding Crane's final evening at their establishment. The journal entries, written in Crane's distinctive handwriting and verified by comparison with other documents bearing his signature, indicated that he had planned to return to his claim immediately after visiting the saloon, specifically to retrieve additional gold he had hidden there before returning to the settlement the following morning to complete his business with Morrison. The entries suggested that Crane had not intended to spend the night at his claim, as the sisters had claimed, but rather had planned to return to the settlement the same evening with additional wealth he had accumulated, but had been too cautious to carry with him during his initial visit to the saloon. As winter settled over the mining district, bringing the seasonal slowdown that characterized the region's economy, and forcing many prospectors to suspend active mining operations until spring, the Ashworth sisters used the quiet months to make significant modifications to their establishment. They hired 2 experienced construction workers from Sacramento, men whose skills were particularly valuable during a period when most building activity in mining communities was suspended due to weather conditions and the temporary exodus of much of the population to more comfortable accommodations in established towns. The workers, whose names and personal details were recorded in a payment ledger that survived in the personal papers of a local contractor and were later examined by territorial investigators, noted that the sisters were unusually specific about the modifications they requested and seemed to possess detailed knowledge about construction techniques that surprised experienced builders. The primary focus of the winter construction project was the excavation of additional storage space beneath the existing basement of the Gilded Rose. The sisters requested that this new storage area be significantly deeper than the original basement, and that it be accessible only through a concealed entrance located behind what appeared to be a solid stone wall in the original basement's back corner. When the workers questioned the necessity of such elaborate secrecy for what was ostensibly a wine cellar, Isadora provided a detailed explanation about their concerns regarding theft of valuable inventory, particularly during periods when the settlement's population was reduced and formal law enforcement was minimal. She mentioned their intention to store not only expensive liquors, but also gold dust and nuggets that customers sometimes left as collateral for credit arrangements, explaining that such valuables required protection that exceeded what was available through conventional storage methods. The workers also noted that the sisters insisted on being present during all phases of the excavation and construction work, taking an active interest in the specific dimensions and structural details of the project that seemed unusual for customers who were simply commissioning routine modifications. Both Cordelia and Isadora demonstrated knowledge about soil composition, drainage requirements, and structural engineering that impressed the experienced construction workers, who had expected to provide guidance and education rather than receive detailed technical specifications from their employers. The sisters also requested that the new storage area include ventilation systems that seemed unnecessarily sophisticated for simple wine storage, specifying requirements for air circulation that suggested they understood the importance of environmental control for preserving delicate materials over extended periods. The winter months also brought a different type of customer to the Gilded Rose, as the establishment became a gathering place for the miners who remained in the area during the off-season. While most of the seasonal prospectors returned to San Francisco, Sacramento, or other established towns to wait out the harsh mountain weather, some miners remained in the district year-round, either because they lacked the resources necessary to relocate temporarily or because they had discovered claims too promising to abandon even during the difficult winter months. These permanent residents, often isolated for weeks at a time by snow and severe weather conditions, found the warmth and companionship of the saloon particularly appealing during the long winter evenings when outdoor work was impossible and social contact was limited. The sisters seemed to understand the particular psychological vulnerabilities of these winter residents, creating an atmosphere of almost familial intimacy that contrasted sharply with the more business-like relationships that characterized most frontier establishments. They offered extended credit arrangements to miners whose income was temporarily reduced by weather conditions, provided hot meals at reasonable prices during periods when other food sources were scarce, and maintained sleeping accommodations above the saloon for those whose own shelters proved inadequate during severe storms. Several miners began treating the Gilded Rose as their primary residence during the winter months, abandoning their remote claims and crude shelters in favor of the relative comfort and security offered by the sisters' establishment. It was during this period of increased intimacy between the proprietors and their customers that Jeremiah Coldwater, a prospector from Missouri who had been working a marginal but steady claim in the nearby hills, began keeping a detailed diary of his daily activities and observations. Coldwater's journal, discovered in 1953 during the demolition of an old boarding house in Nevada City and subsequently donated to the California State Library's manuscript collection, provides the most complete contemporary account of life at the Gilded Rose during the winter of 1849-1850. His entries reveal a gradual shift in the atmosphere of the establishment as the sisters began displaying an increasingly intense interest in the specific details of their customers' mining activities, financial circumstances, and personal backgrounds. Coldwater noted that both Cordelia and Isadora seemed to possess an unusual knowledge of geology, ore processing, and mining techniques that went far beyond what would be expected from individuals who had allegedly arrived in California with no previous experience in gold country. They asked detailed technical questions about his mining methods, inquired about the geological characteristics of his claim, and demonstrated familiarity with advanced concepts related to placer mining and hard rock extraction that surprised him with their sophistication. The sisters also showed particular interest in learning exactly where he and other customers were working their claims, often requesting detailed directions and descriptions that seemed to exceed casual curiosity about their customers' business activities. More concerning to Coldwater was the sisters' apparent fascination with the financial aspects of their customers' mining operations. They regularly inquired about how much gold individual miners had recovered, whether they had shared information about their discoveries with partners or family members back east, and what arrangements they had made for storing or transporting their accumulated wealth. These conversations, which initially seemed like friendly interest in their customers' success, gradually took on a more systematic quality that made Coldwater increasingly uncomfortable. He began to notice that the sisters seemed to be maintaining detailed mental records of each customer's financial situation, remembering specific amounts of gold mentioned in previous conversations and tracking changes in individual miners' apparent wealth over time. The diary entries from February 1850 describe a series of private conversations that Coldwater overheard between the sisters, usually taking place in the early morning hours when they believed their customers were asleep or absent from the establishment. These conversations, conducted in whispers and often interrupted abruptly when the sisters noticed signs that they might be overheard, seemed to involve detailed discussions of their customers' financial situations, personal circumstances, and potential vulnerabilities. Coldwater noted that the sisters appeared to be particularly interested in miners who had recently made significant discoveries, but who had few connections in the broader mining community and limited communication with family or business associates in other regions. The content of these overheard conversations gradually convinced Coldwater that the sisters were gathering intelligence about their customers for purposes that extended beyond simple business interest or social curiosity. He began to document specific details of what he observed, noting that Cordelia and Isadora seemed to be evaluating their customers based on criteria that included not only their wealth, but also their isolation, their likelihood of being missed if they disappeared, and their potential for resistance if confronted by determined adversaries. The sisters' discussions often focused on practical considerations such as which miners traveled alone between their claims and the settlement, which had established regular communication with the outside world and which carried weapons or had military experience that might make them dangerous opponents. Spring brought the return of active mining throughout the district and an influx of new prospectors attracted by rumors of rich strikes in the area. But it also marked the beginning of a pattern of disappearances that would eventually draw the attention of more organized territorial authorities. Silas Pendergast, a merchant who operated a general store in the settlement and who maintained careful records of his transactions with individual customers, began noticing discrepancies in the local gold market that seemed to center around the activities at the Gilded Rose. Pendergast's ledgers, preserved in the archives of the Nevada County Historical Society and examined by researchers in the 1960s as part of a comprehensive study of gold rush commerce, show that several miners had made substantial purchases at his store during the spring of 1850, paying with high-quality gold dust and nuggets, but had subsequently disappeared without completing transactions they had initiated or fulfilling credit arrangements they had established with his business. In each case documented by Pendergast's records, the miners had mentioned their intention to celebrate their recent good fortune at the Ashworth sisters' establishment, often providing specific details about their plans for the evening and their expectations for future purchases, based on their continued mining success. Pendergast's ledgers also indicate that the sisters themselves had become substantial customers during this period, purchasing supplies and equipment that seemed excessive for the operation of a simple saloon and boarding house. Their purchases included large quantities of non-perishable food supplies, mining tools, and what appeared to be medical or surgical instruments, along with unusual amounts of cleaning supplies and materials that could be used for construction or excavation projects. The most significant development in Pendergast's growing suspicions came when he attempted to track down a miner named Zebediah Morse, who had ordered expensive hydraulic mining equipment but had failed to take delivery or provide the substantial payment that had been agreed upon for the specialized machinery. Morse had been working a promising hydraulic claim in a remote canyon and had demonstrated both the technical knowledge and financial resources necessary to make effective use of advanced mining equipment. He had been seen at the Gilded Rose on the evening before his scheduled appointment to finalize the equipment purchase, and when Pendergast inquired about his whereabouts, Cordelia informed the merchant that Morse had mentioned plans to travel to San Francisco to meet with potential investors who were interested in funding an expansion of his mining operation. The explanation provided by Cordelia seemed plausible and was delivered with the same concerned demeanor that had characterized her responses to previous inquiries about missing customers. She provided specific details about Morse's supposed travel plans, mentioning that he had expressed optimism about securing the additional capital necessary to purchase even more sophisticated equipment, and that he had indicated his intention to return within several weeks with definitive arrangements for financing his expanded operation. However, when Pendergast traveled to San Francisco to attempt to locate Morse or to verify the existence of the investors he had supposedly gone to meet, he discovered that no one matching Morse's description had made any inquiries about mining investments at any of the established financial institutions that typically funded such ventures. Additionally, Morse had not registered at any of the hotels or boarding houses that typically accommodated visitors from the goldfields, despite Cordelia's claim that he had planned an extended stay in the city while negotiating his business arrangements. Pendergast's investigation, conducted largely to protect his own business interests and recover the valuable equipment that Morse had ordered, uncovered similar patterns in the cases of other missing miners who had been customers at the Gilded Rose. In each instance, the Ashworth sisters provided plausible explanations for the men's departures, usually involving travel to San Francisco, Sacramento, or other distant locations for business purposes or family emergencies. However, when these explanations were investigated through inquiries at transportation companies, hotels, and business establishments in the destinations mentioned by the sisters, no evidence could be found to support their accounts of their customers' activities or whereabouts. More troubling to Pendergast was his discovery that several of the missing miners had specifically mentioned their distrust of banks and established financial institutions, expressing preference for keeping their accumulated gold in secure personal storage rather than risking deposits with organizations they considered unreliable or potentially fraudulent. These men, according to witnesses who had spoken with them shortly before their disappearances, had carried substantial amounts of gold dust and nuggets with them when they visited the Gilded Rose, representing months or even years of successful mining activity. However, no trace of this wealth had ever been recovered or accounted for, despite the fact that gold was virtually indestructible and should have remained wherever its owners had left it. By summer 1850, the pattern of disappearances had become sufficiently obvious to warrant unofficial attention from territorial authorities who were responsible for maintaining order and protecting commerce throughout the mining districts of Northern California. A deputy marshal named Augustus Thorne was dispatched from Sacramento to investigate the unusually high number of missing persons reports originating from the Nevada County Mining District, along with complaints from merchants and business partners about abandoned financial obligations and unexplained cessation of communication with previously reliable customers. Thorne's investigation, documented in a comprehensive report that was filed with the territorial government but was subsequently lost during the administrative transitions that accompanied California's achievement of statehood, focused specifically on the activities at the Gilded Rose and the suspicious circumstances surrounding the numerous disappearances of the establishment's customers. Thorne's initial observations, recorded in a personal journal that survived in his family's possession until it was donated to the California Historical Society in 1962, described the Ashworth sisters as gracious and cooperative hosts who seemed genuinely concerned about the welfare of their missing customers and eager to assist with any investigation that might help locate them. Cordelia, in particular, impressed the deputy marshal with her detailed knowledge of her customers' personal circumstances, business activities, and stated intentions regarding travel and future plans. She provided comprehensive accounts of her interactions with each of the missing miners, offering specific details about their conversations, their apparent emotional states during their final visits to the establishment, and their expressed concerns about various aspects of their mining operations or personal affairs. Thorne's investigation methods reflected the limited resources and primitive forensic techniques available to law enforcement in the frontier environment. But his persistent questioning and systematic observation gradually began to reveal inconsistencies in the sisters' accounts that raised questions about their truthfulness and potential involvement in the disappearances. He noted that while the sisters claimed that their missing customers had departed for various distant locations, none of these men had been observed leaving the settlement by any of the numerous other residents, merchants, or travelers who regularly used the limited number of roads and trails that provided access to the mining district. The area's isolation and the treacherous nature of the terrain meant that there were only 3 practical routes in or out of the region, and these routes were regularly traveled by merchants, mail carriers, and other residents who would likely have noticed departing travelers, especially those carrying valuable cargo or traveling under unusual circumstances. Thorne also observed that the sisters seemed remarkably well informed about mining operations throughout the district, possessing detailed knowledge about ore quality, extraction methods, and production levels at specific claims that seemed unusual for saloon operators whose business should have been focused primarily on providing food, drink, and lodging to their customers. Their conversations revealed familiarity with technical aspects of both placer and hard rock mining that suggested either extensive previous experience in gold country or unusually intensive study of mining techniques and geology. When questioned about the source of their knowledge, the sisters claimed that they had acquired their understanding through conversations with their customers, but Thorne noted that their level of expertise seemed to exceed what could reasonably be expected from casual exposure to mining discussions. The marshal's investigation took a more serious turn when he discovered evidence of the hidden storage area beneath the Gilded Rose during what was officially described as a routine inspection of the premises to verify compliance with territorial regulations regarding the sale of alcoholic beverages and the maintenance of public accommodations. While examining the basement area to ensure that it met basic safety and sanitation requirements, Thorne noticed irregularities in the construction that suggested the presence of concealed space behind what appeared to be a solid stone wall. The inconsistencies included differences in the aging and weathering of different sections of stonework, variations in construction techniques that indicated different periods of completion, and acoustic properties that suggested the presence of empty space beyond the apparent boundaries of the basement. When Thorne requested permission to examine the basement more thoroughly, including areas that appeared to be private storage space, the sisters initially refused, claiming that the area contained valuable inventory that could be damaged by unauthorized handling, and that their business operations required them to maintain strict security over their stored goods. They also expressed concern about liability issues that might arise if territorial officials were injured while examining areas that were not designed for general access and that contained potentially dangerous equipment or unstable storage arrangements. However, when Thorne explained that his inspection was a legal requirement for maintaining their operating license and that refusal to cooperate could result in immediate closure of their establishment, the sisters reluctantly agreed to provide access to the concealed storage area behind the basement wall. What Thorne discovered in the hidden basement fundamentally altered the nature of his investigation and transformed a routine missing persons inquiry into a potential criminal case of unprecedented scope and severity. The concealed space, accessed through a carefully camouflaged entrance that required specific knowledge of a hidden mechanism to operate, contained an extensive collection of personal effects that clearly belonged to multiple individuals. The items included clothing, mining tools, personal documents, jewelry, weapons, and most significantly, several leather pouches and metal containers filled with gold dust, nuggets, and processed ore. The quantity and variety of the stored items suggested that they had been accumulated over an extended period and that they represented the personal possessions of numerous different individuals. The sisters initially attempted to explain these items as unclaimed property that had been left behind by customers who had departed suddenly from the area, claiming that they had been storing these belongings in hopes that the rightful owners would eventually return to retrieve them. They provided a detailed inventory of many of the items, matching specific objects to particular missing miners whose names appeared in Thorne's investigation records, and expressed their intention to eventually turn over these belongings to proper authorities if the owners failed to return within a reasonable period. Cordelia, in particular, demonstrated remarkable familiarity with the personal histories and circumstances of the missing men, providing detailed explanations for why each individual might have abandoned valuable personal property without making arrangements for its care or retrieval. However, Thorne's careful examination of the personal effects revealed details that fundamentally contradicted the sisters' explanations and suggested a far more sinister explanation for the accumulation of these belongings. Several of the items, particularly mining tools and articles of clothing, showed signs of hasty or violent removal, with torn fabric, broken equipment, and damage patterns that suggested forceful separation from their owners under circumstances involving struggle or resistance. More troubling was Thorne's discovery of extensive bloodstains on numerous pieces of clothing, tools, and other personal effects, stains that the sisters claimed resulted from normal mining accidents and injuries, but which appeared too extensive, too widely distributed, and too varied in their characteristics to support such innocent explanations. The marshal also noted that the gold dust and nuggets found in the storage area displayed characteristics that matched or samples from specific claims that had been abandoned following their owners' disappearances, suggesting that the precious metal had been extracted from locations that were no longer being actively worked by their original discoverers. The quantity of gold found in the hidden storage area was substantial, representing thousands of dollars in accumulated wealth that seemed far beyond what would be expected from the normal operations of a frontier saloon. Additionally, the gold showed evidence of recent processing and refinement, indicating that raw ore had been systematically extracted and prepared for sale or transport, activities that would have required specialized knowledge and equipment not normally associated with saloon operations. Thorne's investigation was complicated by the legal and administrative challenges that characterized frontier law enforcement during the territorial period of California's history. The territorial government's authority was limited by inadequate funding, insufficient personnel, and unclear jurisdictional boundaries that often left local officials uncertain about their responsibilities and legal powers. Communication with higher authorities was slow and unreliable, depending on mail service that was frequently interrupted by weather, transportation difficulties, and the general chaos that characterized frontier society. Moreover, the transient nature of the mining population made it extremely difficult to establish definitive timelines for disappearances, locate potential witnesses who might have left the area, or verify the identities and backgrounds of individuals who had few connections to established communities or institutions. The sisters' explanation for the stored belongings, while highly suspicious given the evidence of violence and the systematic nature of the accumulation, was not entirely implausible in the context of frontier life where sudden departures, abandoned property, and interrupted business relationships were common occurrences. Many miners did indeed leave the goldfield suddenly when their claims proved unprofitable, when they received urgent news from family members back east, when they became involved in disputes that made continued residence dangerous, or when they simply decided that the hardships and risks of mining life outweighed its potential rewards. The informal nature of most business relationships and the general absence of formal record-keeping meant that property abandonment and unfulfilled financial obligations were regular features of frontier commerce. The case against the Ashworth sisters might have remained inconclusive and might never have progressed beyond the level of official suspicion if not for the discovery of Jeremiah Coldwater's body in a collapsed mine shaft approximately 2 miles northeast of the Gilded Rose. Coldwater had been missing for several weeks, and his disappearance had initially been attributed to the kinds of mining accidents or encounters with dangerous wildlife that claimed many lives throughout the goldfields. However, when his body was recovered by other prospectors who were exploring the area in search of new claims to work, the circumstances of his death immediately raised serious questions about the sisters' potential involvement in what appeared to be a deliberate homicide rather than an accidental death. Coldwater's body showed clear evidence of blunt force trauma to the head and upper torso that was entirely inconsistent with injuries that would result from a mining accident or accidental fall into a mine shaft. The pattern and severity of the injuries suggested that he had been struck repeatedly with a heavy object, possibly a mining tool such as a pick handle or shovel, and that the attack had been sustained and deliberate rather than the result of a single accidental impact. Additionally, his personal effects, including a valuable pocket watch that had been a family heirloom, a substantial amount of gold dust that he was known to have accumulated from his recent mining activities, and a distinctive belt buckle that had been mentioned by several witnesses, were missing from the scene where his body was discovered. More significantly for Thorne's investigation, Coldwater's detailed diary was discovered, hidden in his abandoned mining camp, concealed beneath loose floorboards in a way that suggested he had deliberately hidden it to prevent discovery by potential intruders. The diary contained entries that extended almost to the date of his disappearance and provided a day-by-day account of his growing suspicions about the Ashworth sisters and his increasing belief that they were somehow connected to the disappearances of other miners in the area. Coldwater had systematically documented what he interpreted as evidence of criminal activity, including detailed descriptions of the sisters' late-night conversations, notes about discrepancies between their public statements and their private behavior, and observations about their unusual knowledge of their customers' financial circumstances and personal vulnerabilities. The final entries in Coldwater's diary, written during the days immediately preceding his disappearance, recorded his intention to share his concerns and evidence with the next representative of territorial authority who visited the settlement. He had apparently become convinced that the sisters were responsible for multiple murders and had been planning to present a formal complaint to law enforcement officials. His diary entries also revealed that he had begun taking precautions to protect himself from what he perceived as increasing danger, including varying his daily routines, avoiding solitary travel to remote areas, and making arrangements to hide his accumulated gold and valuable personal possessions in locations that would be difficult for potential attackers to discover. The discovery of Coldwater's diary provided Marshall Thorne with documentary evidence that supported his growing suspicions about the Ashworth sisters and justified more intensive investigation of their activities and potential criminal involvement. However, when Thorne returned to the settlement with additional personnel and formal legal authorization to conduct a comprehensive search of the Gilded Rose premises, he found that the sisters had departed during the night, abandoning their establishment and leaving behind clear evidence of hasty preparation for immediate departure. The saloon showed obvious signs of rapid abandonment, with valuable inventory left behind. Business records scattered throughout the building and personal belongings left in the private quarters above the main floor. Most tellingly, the sisters had made obvious attempts to conceal or destroy evidence before their departure, including efforts to seal the hidden storage area in the basement and to remove or destroy documents that might have provided additional evidence of their criminal activities. However, their hasty departure had prevented them from completing these efforts at concealment, leaving behind substantial physical evidence that clearly demonstrated their involvement in multiple murders and thefts. The abandoned establishment became a crime scene that provided territorial investigators with unprecedented insight into what appeared to be a systematic criminal operation that had been targeting successful miners throughout the region for months. Thorne's subsequent investigation of the abandoned Gilded Rose revealed the full extent of what appeared to be a carefully planned and methodically executed criminal enterprise that had been designed to identify, target, and eliminate successful miners while stealing their accumulated wealth. The hidden basement contained personal effects from at least 15 different individuals, along with detailed written records that demonstrated the sisters' systematic approach to selecting and monitoring potential victims. These records, written primarily in Isadora's precise handwriting, included comprehensive information about individual miners' claim locations or quality assessments, production estimates, financial circumstances, and, most disturbing, detailed evaluations of each target's connections to the outside world and likelihood of being missed if he disappeared permanently. The documents revealed that the sisters had been conducting what amounted to intelligence-gathering operations against their customers, systematically collecting information about their backgrounds, family relationships, business partnerships, and communication patterns with individuals outside the immediate mining district. They had been particularly interested in identifying miners who were socially isolated, financially successful, and unlikely to be immediately missed by family members, business associates, or other members of the mining community. The records also included detailed plans for disposing of victims' bodies and personal effects, along with strategies for explaining their disappearances to other community members and territorial authorities. Physical evidence found at the abandoned site strongly supported the theory that the sisters had been murdering their victims within the confines of their establishment and then disposing of the bodies in remote locations throughout the surrounding area. The basement showed extensive blood staining that had been partially cleaned, but remained clearly visible under careful examination by experienced investigators. Several areas of the basement floor showed evidence of recent excavation and refilling, suggesting that additional evidence or possibly additional victims might be buried beneath the building's foundation. The hidden storage area contained tools and equipment that appeared to have been specifically designed for dismemberment and disposal of human remains, including saws, knives, and chemical substances that could have been used to accelerate decomposition. Most conclusive was the discovery of human remains buried in carefully concealed graves beneath the basement floor, remains that showed clear evidence of violent death and that were associated with personal items belonging to several of the missing miners whose disappearances had initially triggered Thorne's investigation. The remains exhibited trauma patterns consistent with the injuries observed on Coldwater's body, suggesting that the sisters had developed and repeatedly employed specific methods for killing their victims. The systematic nature of the burials and the care taken to conceal them demonstrated that the murders had been planned and executed with deliberate precision rather than committed impulsively during moments of emotional distress or desperation. The territorial authorities issued formal warrants for the arrest of Cordelia and Isadora Ashworth on charges including multiple counts of premeditated murder, grand theft, conspiracy, and a violation of various territorial statutes governing commercial operations and public safety. However, despite extensive efforts to locate and apprehend the sisters, including coordination with law enforcement agencies throughout California, Oregon, and Nevada territories, they were never successfully captured or brought to trial. Reports of women matching their physical descriptions and displaying similar behavioral characteristics surfaced periodically throughout the region during the months and years following their disappearance, but none of these sightings were confirmed or led to arrests. The investigation eventually concluded that the sisters had most likely fled to Mexico, where territorial authorities had no jurisdiction and where the chaotic political conditions of the period would have made pursuit virtually impossible. Alternative theories suggested that they might have assumed new identities and relocated to remote areas of the Oregon Territory or the Mormon settlements in Utah, where their past activities would be unknown and where they could potentially establish new criminal enterprises. Some investigators speculated that they might have returned to the eastern United States using false identities and forged documents, taking advantage of the limited communication and record-keeping systems of the period to disappear into the general population of established communities where their frontier past would not attract attention. The Gilded Rose itself was eventually demolished by order of territorial authorities, who determined that the building had become a public nuisance and a source of ongoing concern for area residents. The site was officially declared unsuitable for future construction and was avoided by subsequent settlers, who considered it cursed or unlucky based on the horrific crimes that had been committed there. Local residents reported strange sounds and unexplained phenomena occurring at the site for years after the building's destruction, though such reports were generally attributed to psychological effects resulting from knowledge of the site's violent history, rather than to any supernatural causes. The final official report on the Ashworth sisters case, filed by Marshall Thorne in the autumn of 1851 and subsequently archived in the territorial government's criminal investigation files, estimated that Cordelia and Isadora Ashworth had been responsible for at least 17 confirmed murders and had stolen gold and personal property worth several $1,000s over the course of their approximately 18-month criminal career. The report noted that their operation had been characterized by careful planning, systematic execution, and sophisticated understanding of both human psychology and frontier legal systems. Thorne's analysis concluded that the sisters had arrived in California with specific criminal intentions and had deliberately chosen their location and business operation to maximize their opportunities for identifying and exploiting potential victims. The Marshal's report also emphasized the unprecedented nature of the crimes, both in terms of their scope and their systematic organization. Previous criminal activity in the mining districts had typically involved impulsive violence, crimes of opportunity, or disputes arising from claim jumping and other competitive aspects of frontier life. The Ashworth sisters' operation represented a new category of frontier criminality, characterized by long-term planning, sophisticated deception, and methodical execution that demonstrated criminal capabilities far beyond what had previously been encountered by territorial law enforcement agencies. Years later, when the gold rush had ended and the Nevada County mining district had evolved into more settled agricultural and commercial communities, long-time residents would occasionally share stories about the Ashworth sisters and their sinister establishment. These oral histories, passed down through generations of families who had lived in the area during the territorial period, often focused on the strange and oppressive atmosphere that had surrounded the Gilded Rose even before the full extent of the sisters' crimes became known. Many residents recalled feeling inexplicably uneasy when visiting the establishment, describing a sense of being watched or evaluated that seemed to exceed normal commercial interest in customers' welfare and business. Some accounts describe the unnatural silence that seemed to emanate from the building during certain hours, particularly late at night, when the establishment should have been filled with the sounds of normal activity and conversation. Residents reported that the building seemed to absorb sound rather than reflect it, creating an acoustic dead zone that made conversations difficult and that contributed to the generally unsettling atmosphere surrounding the sisters' operation. Other witnesses recalled observing the sisters engaged in intense private conversations that ceased abruptly whenever other people approached, suggesting that they were constantly planning or discussing activities that they preferred to keep secret from their customers and neighbors. The case of the Gilded Rose became a cautionary tale that was repeated throughout the mining districts of California and other Western territories, serving as a warning about the dangers that could lurk beneath the surface of apparently legitimate frontier businesses. The story was incorporated into the folklore of the Gold Rush era, often serving as an example of how the isolation and lawlessness of frontier society could provide opportunities for predators as well as legitimate fortune seekers. The tale was eventually documented by territorial historians and was included in several early accounts of California's frontier period, though many of the specific details were lost or distorted when early government records were destroyed in courthouse fires that swept through several California counties in the late 19th century. In 1963, when archaeological excavations were conducted at the former site of the Gilded Rose as part of a historical preservation project sponsored by the California Historical Society, investigators discovered additional human remains that had apparently been overlooked during the original investigation more than a century earlier. These remains, along with artifacts that included mining tools, personal jewelry, and fragments of clothing, suggested that the sisters' criminal activities may have been even more extensive than originally believed, and may have included victims whose disappearances were never officially reported or investigated. However, by this time, more than a century had passed since the original crimes, and there was little practical purpose to be served by reopening the investigation or attempting to identify additional victims. The archaeological findings were carefully documented and archived, but no attempt was made to pursue any remaining leads in the case or to conduct additional searches for evidence that might still exist at other locations in the area. The investigation confirmed that the site had been used for the systematic disposal of murder victims and provided additional evidence of the sophisticated planning and execution that had characterized the sisters' criminal operation. However, the passage of time and the deaths of all potential witnesses meant that the archaeological discoveries served primarily to confirm historical accounts rather than to provide new information about the specific details of individual crimes. The story of Cordelia and Isadora Ashworth represents one of the most disturbing and significant criminal cases in the violent history of California's Gold Rush period, serving as a reminder that the pursuit of wealth has always attracted both legitimate opportunity seekers and predators willing to exploit the vulnerabilities of others for criminal gain. Their ability to operate successfully for more than a year in a relatively small and close-knit community demonstrates how the social chaos and legal vacuum of frontier society could provide effective cover even for the most heinous and extensive criminal enterprises. Perhaps most troubling is the calculated and systematic nature of their operation, which suggests that they viewed their victims not as fellow human beings deserving of basic moral consideration, but simply as sources of wealth to be harvested when circumstances provided appropriate opportunities. The case also illustrates the primitive state of law enforcement during the Gold Rush era and highlights the numerous practical and legal challenges that face territorial authorities attempting to maintain order and protect citizens in frontier communities. Marshall Thorne's investigation, while ultimately successful in uncovering the truth about the sisters' crimes, was severely hampered by limited resources, inadequate communication systems, primitive forensic techniques, and the general absence of established legal institutions that could provide support for complex criminal investigations. His inability to apprehend the sisters before they fled the territory highlights the practical difficulties of pursuing justice in an environment where criminals could easily disappear into the vast, sparsely settled regions of the American West, and where cooperation between different jurisdictions was minimal or non-existent. The psychological profile that emerges from the available evidence suggests that Cordelia and Isadora Ashworth were sophisticated predators who had carefully studied their intended operating environment and had identified the most effective methods for exploiting it to achieve their criminal objectives. Their decision to operate a saloon provided them with strategic access to information about potential victims, while creating a social environment where isolated and vulnerable men would voluntarily make themselves accessible to systematic evaluation and targeting. Their systematic approach to victim selection, based on careful assessment of wealth, isolation, and vulnerability to attack, demonstrates a level of planning and calculation that distinguishes their crimes from the typically impulsive violence that characterized most frontier criminality. The sisters' ability to maintain their criminal operation for an extended period without generating immediate suspicion also suggests a sophisticated understanding of human psychology and frontier social dynamics. They were able to project convincing images of respectability and legitimate business operation while simultaneously identifying and exploiting the weaknesses of their intended victims. Their explanations for the disappearances of their customers were carefully crafted to be plausible within the context of frontier life, while being sufficiently vague and untestable to discourage detailed investigation by authorities who lack the resources and expertise necessary for a comprehensive criminal investigation. This combination of social manipulation, criminal planning, and systematic execution represents a level of sophisticated criminal enterprise that was unusual even in the violent and lawless context of Gold Rush, California. The sisters' crimes demonstrated that frontier society, despite its reputation for rough justice and community self-policing, could be vulnerable to criminal operations that were sufficiently well-planned and carefully executed to avoid detection until after extensive damage had been done to individual victims and the broader community. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Ashworth sisters' story is the realization that their crimes might never have been discovered if not for a series of fortunate circumstances that included the accidental preservation of Jeremiah Coldwater's diary, the persistence of Marshall Thorne's investigation, and the sisters' apparent haste in abandoning their operation before they could complete their efforts to destroy incriminating evidence. The isolated nature of their victims, the transient character of the mining community, and the general absence of systematic record-keeping created an environment where multiple murders could occur over an extended period without generating immediate concern or triggering formal investigation. This suggests that the Ashworth sisters' operation may have been representative of similar criminal enterprises that operated successfully throughout the Gold Rush era without ever being detected, documented, or prosecuted by contemporary authorities. The combination of social isolation, limited law enforcement resources, and general frontier lawlessness created conditions that were conducive to systematic criminal activity, and it is entirely possible that other predators took advantage of these conditions to commit crimes that were never discovered or that were attributed to the accidents, violence, and disappearances that were considered normal features of frontier life. The legacy of the Gilded Rose extends beyond its significance as a crime scene to encompass broader questions about the moral and social costs of rapid economic development and social change during periods of historical transition. The gold rush attracted individuals from diverse geographical and social backgrounds, including some who saw the frontier environment as an opportunity to engage in criminal behavior with relative impunity. The Ashworth sisters' story serves as a reminder that the popular narrative of westward expansion and economic opportunity was accompanied by darker realities that are often overlooked or minimized in romanticized historical accounts that emphasize individual heroism, entrepreneurial success, and the triumph of civilization over wilderness. The systematic nature of the sisters' crimes and their apparent success in evading justice also raise questions about the effectiveness of frontier justice and the informal social control mechanisms that were supposed to substitute for established legal institutions in newly settled territories. The mining community's failure to detect or prevent the sisters' criminal activities, despite their extensive scope and duration, suggests that frontier society's capacity for self-policing was limited and that informal justice systems were inadequate for dealing with sophisticated criminal enterprises that operated outside the boundaries of traditional frontier conflicts and disputes. Today, the site where the Gilded Rose once stood is marked only by a small historical plaque that briefly describes the building's significance in local mining history, without making any specific reference to the murders that took place there or the criminal activities of the sisters who operated the establishment. The plaque's sanitized description reflects a common tendency in historical commemoration to emphasize the positive aspects of frontier development, while minimizing or ignoring the violence and criminal activity that were also characteristic features of the Gold Rush era. However, local residents and regional historians continue to preserve the memory of the Ashworth sisters' crimes, understanding that their story serves as an important reminder of the dark possibilities that can emerge when economic opportunity intersects with moral breakdown, and when the absence of effective legal institutions creates environments where criminal predators can operate with relative impunity. The case remains relevant to contemporary discussions about the relationship between economic development, social stability, and criminal justice, serving as a historical example of how rapid social change can create opportunities for criminal exploitation of vulnerable populations. The investigation of the Gilded Rose murders also contributed to the development of more sophisticated law enforcement techniques and interjurisdictional cooperation procedures that would eventually become standard features of American criminal justice systems. Marshall Thorne's systematic approach to evidence collection, witness interviewing, and case documentation established precedents that influenced subsequent criminal investigations throughout the Western territories and contributed to the gradual professionalization of frontier law enforcement agencies. The case demonstrated the importance of maintaining detailed records, coordinating investigations across jurisdictional boundaries, and developing specialized techniques for investigating complex criminal enterprises that extended beyond simple crimes of violence or property theft. These lessons proved valuable as frontier societies evolved into more established communities that required increasingly sophisticated approaches to maintaining order and protecting citizens from criminal activity. The story of Cordelia and Isadora Ashworth thus serves multiple functions in the historical record of frontier California, providing insight into both the criminal possibilities that existed during the Gold Rush era and the gradual development of more effective legal institutions that were capable of detecting and prosecuting sophisticated criminal enterprises. Their crimes represent a significant chapter in the evolution of American criminal justice and serve as a reminder that the establishment of effective legal institutions remains a continuing challenge for any society undergoing rapid economic and social transformation.